sewn, and this is how it looks after you have sewn. Let me just trim some of these naughty threads, and we are basically ready to attach the lining to the skirt, to the main bodice of the skirt. So what I will be doing is turning the lining wrong side out, and we are going to be inserting the skirt with the right side up into the lining. The right side of the lining facing the right side of the outer skirt. And what we're going to do is basically, let me first trim this little ear of our lining here, because we don't need it anymore. And we also don't need it here. So what we're going to do is we're going to pin the right side of the lining to the right side of the skirt, but you're going to pin the edges together. So we're going to be basically encasing the zip. The zip is going to be sandwiched in between. I'm just going to put pins like that. I'm going to sew the lining to the zip all the way down, like all the way down here. We're going to sew as far as we can, which is basically up to where the zipper pull is. So just lining it all up. We're going to be using for this a half foot, or if you don't have a half foot, you can move the needle of your machine as close as possible to where the zip tip is. However, not too close, because when it's too close and you sew the zip like that, basically when you try to close the zip, it's going to be caught on the lining and that will rip the lining. So something like 3 millimeters away should be fine. Okay, so I'm pinning on a straight line. I'll pin just below where here's the zipper pull. I'm going to pin a bit lower just to keep the lining sitting straight. Back stitch at the beginning and at the end of this seam. From where my stitching on the lining stopped to where the lining is, there's still like a small gap. It's okay to have that gap. It's actually good to have that gap. Let's match the other side of our lining. Actually, let me show you through the right side how it looks. First of all, so here is how it looks on the right side. What we have to do now is I'm going to close the center back zip, and what I need you to do, and I'm going to show you now, is to mark where the end of the waistband with the binding ends, and we need to transfer it to the opposite side, because we need to make sure that when we look inside of our skirt once it's done, that the waistband matches at the same level. If it's lower or higher, it doesn't look nice. Is where my waistband needs to match. Needs to hit right at this point, so we have an even waistband. I'm going to turn wrong sides out, and I'm going to match. I'm going to open again the zip, and we're going to match right sides together. And first and foremost, I really don't like threads hanging. We're going to add the bottom edge of the binding to that marking. If you don't want anything to move when you're sewing, I would suggest that you hand baste the 3 layers together, so the waistband, the zip, and the skirt itself. Okay, so we're going to go. The most important place to match on this skirt when you do the second half is the waistband, because this is going to be a very obvious point when you turn, and then you see that they match nicely at the same spot. I think this is what gives it, you know, a very luxurious feel, is that when you make something that all things, where they're supposed to match, like seams should be matching, understitching, you know, it's on point, it's not crooked or anything. I think this is what gives the feel of luxury, is that everything is neatly done. So now we're going to sew the opposite side. I will be more comfortable to sew this from the bottom up. I have to be careful that the spot on the waistband needs to be right there. I can't move that, so I might sew over my pin when I'm approaching that, so it doesn't move. And I'm going to use my screwdriver just to hold the lining, so the lining doesn't move either. Now we have done the second side of our lining. Let's turn it right sides out. And let's have a look. Yes, it's in a pretty good spot. So they do match. So this is basically what you need to watch out when attaching the lining, is the waistband where it matches. So now I'm just going to briefly press it on the ironing board just to make sure that on the sleeve board, and I'm just going to lightly press the back of the line. Now we have our center back zip enclosed, and we're going to do the waistband, to close the waistband. So what we're going to do is to turn the skirt wrong sides out, and with the waistband, right sides facing the skirt, the right side of the waistband with the right side of the skirt, we're going to match them at the center front. Where's the center front? Here. And the center front of the skirt. We're going to pin it all around. I like to do first where the notches are, so in this case the center front, side seams are usually the first places I like to pin, and everywhere and everything out. To do is on the center back where we have the zip, we're going to turn the seam allowance of the center back towards the waistband. That includes the zip itself. going to do the same. I don't know if I have mentioned, I don't remember anymore, but I had changed the color of my thread to match the lining while I do all the binding and everything. So this is one of the things that's nice to do if you're doing a lining that's of a different color, to have the stitching of the binding, the color of the thread on the binding matching the lining color. But now I will switch back to the color I have been originally sewing the skirt. So now we have our whole skirt, and again, just make sure that the center back seam where the zip is, the seam allowances are turned to the sides. And we're ready. I'm going to sew with the waistband facing up and just holding taut the waistband, the whole waist. Back stitch at the beginning. I'm just going to pull. Now that we have sewn the waistband, we're going to press the waistline just to sink in the stitches. After we have sewn and pressed the seam allowance on the waistband, we're going to do a few things. I like to trim the seam allowance that's inside of the waistband just to reduce some bulk, and we're going to do this like that. So we're going to do this in all darts and side seams. Okay, I've done on the back side, and then now let's do on the side seams. Okay, so I've done all of them. And just get rid of these little bits. And the second step after that is to reduce the seam allowance of the waistband only. I'm going to take my big scissors. Actually, I'm also going to clip diagonally the seam allowance of the zip. So I'm just staying away about 2 to 3 millimeters, and I'm going to do that with the big scissors. My next thing is to reduce the seam allowance of the waistband, only on the waistband. I'm reducing it by half, and I'm keeping the outside as is. Now we have our seam allowances trimmed, and we're going to turn it right side out. And when we turn the skirt right side out, I want to make sure that the corner where the zip is nicely turned like that, so it'll be a square, squared off. And we can see Now I'm going to press all the seam allowances towards the lining, and we're going to do this all around the waistband area. I have pressed all the seam allowance on the waistline towards the waistband. We are going to do one last thing before we understitch this area. Let me just push out the zip again, because I pushed it back in when I was pressing the seam allowances just now. And let me turn it right side out so we have a better view of what I'm about to show you. Essentially, we're going to understitch the waistline, but one thing I want us to do is to do a little bit of a marking here, where we're going to begin and where we're going to stop the understitching when we are at the machine. I like to at least have some sort of marking on both sides that they look symmetrical, so once you turn, you know, when you have the skirt and then you turn it wrong, the inside of the skirt out, so the lining, we have a symmetrical understitching all around the waistband. So this is what I'm going to do. I will 2 centimeters. Let's do 2.5, because I really can't manage to get so close to the zip, but we'll go as close as we can. And in this case, I'm going to do my understitching all around the waistband is going to stop 2 centimeters away on both sides from the zip. This way it looks symmetrical. 1 millimeter, maximum 2, from the seam line of the waistband. I hope you can see. And feel underneath if you don't have any lining or anything getting in the way. You should just feel the seam allowances and nothing. I'm going to be using my sleeve board. I like to use a sleeve board because I press only the area I need to press without pressing and creating wrinkles elsewhere. If you have one, I would, or if you don't have one, I would highly recommend that to you. I have our skirt ready to have the lining on the bottom hem attached. First of all, I want to check is that your lining hasn't grown. So basically the raw edge of the lining needs to match, especially on the back, I would say, the raw hem of the skirt, and try to see whether your lining is longer than it should be, because the lining is not supposed to be seen from the outside, and you should have a gap of at least something like a centimeter and a half all around, and you should have somewhat what it would be like a fold. It's essentially the lining shouldn't be hanging. It can't be too short either, because if it is short, it's going to pull the outside of the skirt in. We do need a fold at the bottom of the lining, because this allows the lining to move while you sit, while you move. So basically, let me just check. The back is fine. If the front is also okay, you should be fine. There is a gap because sometimes the lining does grow, and yeah. So now what we're going to do, I'm going to go to every seam and match the seams. I'll match the seam with a pin. I'm turning the hem, and I'm going to pin it from the inside, because we're going to have the hem pinned all around. Okay, let me. I pinned the pins is inside. I will also match on the side seams. Put 2 pins to hold the seam allowance open. I will also do the same thing on the sides. Actually, I will turn the whole thing wrong side out, and I'm going to pin the hem all around. Where I have pinned, and I will match the skirt on the front. The bottom notch on the lining, that's at the very center, we're going to match with the center front notch on the hem of the skirt, and we're going to pin the same way. From the center of the front to the side seams again. Center back of the skirt, and I'm going to pin between the side seams and the center back to keep the lining taut. And now from the center back to the opposite side seam. On the back side of the skirt, we are not going to sew for about 15 centimeters. It can be on either side of the skirt, so I'm just going to mark a 10 to 15 centimeters gap. I will mark on this side, and I like to leave it not so much on the center but a little bit to the side. Meters gap. And what we're going to do with the hem of the skirt facing up, we're going to sew the lining all around, but we're not going to sew on this area here because we're going to leave this as an opening so we can turn the skirt right side. I'm going to begin at one of the markings vertically into the seam allowance, and then I'm going to sew all around at 1 centimeter. I'm going to remove the pins as I go. Okay, so we have now sewn the whole hem, with the exception of the opening on the side of the back. Let me show you where it is. I like to, when I leave an opening like this, I like to do a vertical seam into the seam allowance, because when turning the garment right side out, it puts a lot of strain on this area here. So when you sew into the seam allowance vertically like I did, it won't rip basically in these areas. I'm going to start on the side seam. You can start anyway because this is not going to be seen, so don't worry. I filmed a little bit of the sewing the blind hem, but I'm not sure it wasn't visible. I was off the camera. So let me show you how I do it. Basically, I pull the hem open, and what I like to do, I like to stitch my blind hem with in between the hem of the skirt and the fabric of the outer skirt. So on the side seams, I have already anchored here, so with the previous stitches, so I'm not going to do this quite as much now. So I anchor the stitch and I catch the smallest amount of interfacing on the skirt. Make sure that you're not actually catching the fabric, and into the hem, so just below the stitching line, and we're going to go on a zigzag from the outer skirt to the hem of the skirt. And this stitch doesn't have to be big, it's small. Actually, it's better if it's a little bit on the wider side, because you make sure that the stitching is not going to leave marks on the outside, basically. And the fact that we're actually doing the hem on the inside, we're doing the blind stitch inside the hem instead of the top here. This allows us not to have later a line that marks the top of the hem of the skirt. So this is how I like to do it. And wherever I get to side seams, back seam stitches, I like to reinforce more my stitches. I knot them. I know they're not going to break, or if they do, at least, you know, like I said, it's not going to bring the whole hem down. So fold back the rim more of the hem, and then we continue just catching the interfacing. Just anchored the stitch on the side seams, and let me show you how it looks all the other places, so you can see there is, give you a bit more perspective. You almost can't see because it's the thread itself is very light and it's catching a little bit of the interfacing, not the fabric. I know this looks very strange, but now we're going to turn the skirt right sides out, and we're going to use the opening that we have here to turn the skirt. We can grab a little bit and slowly pull the skirt bit by bit out. Okay, so now we have our skirt and it's fully lined. I'm going to turn it, the lining on the side of the lining out. Okay, so we have a beautiful lined skirt, and let me check on the front. Lovely. What we're going to do now is secure the waistband to the outer skirt, and I'm going to do that by adding some pins. I will add a pin, put it a bit higher, and I'm catching the outer skirt also here, so I'm catching the dart just something like a centimeter above the binding, and I will do the same on the side seams. Just make sure everything is sitting flat. And we're going to do on the right side. Now I have a all-purpose thread, the same one I have sewn the lining. It could have been also the color that I sewed the outside, it doesn't matter because this is going to be on the inside. But I need an all-purpose thread. I'm just knotting the ends because I need it to be a double thread. And what we're going to do is to reach out through the back opening on the lining to these areas where we have the pins, and we're going to loosely stitch on the seam allowance of the waistband to the seam allowance of the darts and side seams, we're going to first of all anchor the seams. Make sure you're not catching anything from the right that's going to be seen on the right side. I'm going to do I'm not using the needle that I use for my hem, because that needle is very precious to me. It's a very fine needle and I don't want to lose. Just using a normal thread, needle, and I'm just connecting the two sides, and in between them I'm going to wrap the thread around itself, kind of making a going around the thread, and I'm going to anchor and knot on the dart bulk. And then thread through the dart bulk and cut it off. I'm going to repeat this once again on every dart and every side seam, connecting them. This way our waistband, when we're wearing, and I've just sewn this, you should have some slack between the outer skirt and the lining. It shouldn't be tight, so there is, you know, some movement here, but it's not enough for the waistband to go up. Now we're going to press the hem of the lining up, but first of all I think I would like to remove I will remove it after, actually. You can remove it now, the running stitch that's holding the hem up, if your fabric marks, or you can leave it in if your fabric doesn't mark. And we are going to just press the lining seam allowance up, including the area that's open on the lining. We're going to press it up, just to, it's a light pressing, it's not anything too heavy, because we don't want to imprint the hem of the skirt on the outside. And especially this kind of lining that's very, lining is very lightweight. It presses very easily with heat. So I'm just anchoring the whole thing up to smooth it. Now we're going to close this opening. I'm going just to add a few pins. So I'm leveling, make sure that, it's a straight line. It's not going up, it's not going down. But so this way it doesn't look like there is an opening here. I will be using a thread that matches my lining color. And we're going to slip stitch the hem. I have a knot on my thread, and what I'm going to do is to anchor the knot towards the inside of the hem. Actually, it would be easier if I sew from this side. So my knot is going to be, I want to position it in a way that's on the inside, and it won't be showed. Blind stitch is basically going inside the fabric, just the hem side, and then out on the lining. And then from the same place you go back you travel through the lining, something like a stitch length of, 3 millimeters, and back into the skirt hem, and then through the lining again, travel a couple of 3mm, and then skirt up into the lining, 3mm, skirt, lining. You have to travel through the lining fold, and you can see that it looks like you don't see the stitches. Back into the line and back into the hem, up into the lining. You have to travel through the lining. Sorry, I'm having trouble to see. Easier way is to just, because I'm having trouble to see on this fabric, go through the lining, through the hem, sorry, up. You don't have to travel through the lining. It's a little faster if you just cut like a teensy tiny bit of lining, travel through the hem of the skirt, back up, traveling 3mm into the hem of the skirt instead of how I was doing here. This way is faster, that way is neater. But at the end of the day, you barely can see. The other way that you travel through the hem of the lining looks more like the stitching of the machine. This way you have just like a tiniest, the tiniest stitch on the lining side. So you travel through the hem, up to the lining, down into the hem again, travel 3mm, down into the hem of the skirt again, travel through 3mm, up through the lining, down through the hem, 3mm, up. Okay, now we're going to anchor the stitch. Just knotting on the outside, and then I'm going between the skirt and the hem of the lining, sorry, the skirt outer and the hem, and I'm traveling with the thread through between them. I'm just going to pull it out, and here is our slip stitch. Now I have removed all the running stitches that we had on a hem, and I'm going to press the lining to its final position. But first let's press the area where we have slip stitched, just very lightly without applying too much strength on the hem, because we don't want especially on plain fabrics, it will be very obvious if you press too hard on the hem. And now we're going to bring the lining down, and we're going to press a light crease on the hem of the lining. this is how our skirt looks after we have pressed the hem all around, and we have this lovely fold here at the bottom that will allow us to move without pulling the outer skirt inside. I think the final result is very beautiful. Show you on the right side, and it's a very simple design, but you can, if you want to make it have more features, like, I don't know, adding patch pockets or belt loops, you can add it as well. These are very easy alterations you can do that actually doesn't impact on the overall look of the skirt. And I hope you have enjoyed sewing it, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you make with it.